It's time for Cutting Edge Consciousness with Freeman Michaels and Barnett Bain. Thought-provoking discussions and bold ideas from the edge of possibility.
Freeman Michaels here with my co-host.
Barnett Bain, good to be here this morning. I say that every week, and it's always good to be here.
Well,
Although I'm a little flustered, I've got to say. I'm a little flustered.
Why are you flustered?
Well, let's see if this resonates with you, Freeman. So I'm rushing to get out of the house, make it down to the studio.
Well, that part resonates with me.
Yeah.
Rushing to get
And
out
I
of the house.
step up to the door, and Sandy is walking around with a cup of tea in her hand, and she is in, my wife's an agent for any of our listeners that are new to the show. She's on the line early in New York, and she's negotiating a pretty sizable deal.
Right.
And I'm curious, so I'm listening, and I'm hearing, what did you wear?
Right. Those
I'm hearing
intense
I'm hearing
negotiations.
about the kids.
Yeah.
I'm hearing about somebody's boyfriend. I'm hearing about vacations.
Yeah.
I'm hearing about mothers-in-law, and I'm dying here. I'm crawling out of myself, and I'm going, what is the bottom? Cut to the
Where's the money?
Cut to the bottom
Right.
line. What is the deal? It's so I still don't know what
That's
it is.
fantastic.
I left. She waved me off. I think she waved me off while she was hearing about somebody's role as like the Sugar Plum Fairy in the next school play. It is unbelievably excruciating, men and women.
Well, it isn't just men and women. Listen, everyone does business differently. And, the reality is if you surround yourself with people who you like doing business with, that personal sense of enjoying them as people, it creates a certain quality in the business environment. I know that that's not typical, and you and I maybe aren't wired as much in that way, but I appreciate that. And I know both men and women.
Well,
who
you're a
have that.
sensitive guy, so
Yeah.
I know that you would certainly be
Well, and I've
right
run
in that conversation about...
No, and I've run a couple companies, and there's a whole part of where Jose, who used to be my business manager, we'd walk every morning, and a good part of the walk was just checking in about his girlfriend in the weekend and what happened, and his brother or whatever.
You're a sensitive dude.
Thank you very much.
I love that about you.
But we also transitioned and got into what we wanted to do with the day or the week or whatever the conversation was about. I think it's a balance. I think it's really important actually to have that kind of personalized investment, and that's a great thing to have in a
it certainly
business relationship.
takes some developing of awareness of these other styles, and I'm sure that by 4 o'clock when I get home tonight, I'll probably walk in just as they are getting down to business.
Right.
So that I'm not missing.
right.
I'm not missing a thing, which is a really terrific segue as this works out, as life would have it,
Yeah.
with our guest today. So I want to jump in there because the clock is ticking. We have with us today Dr. Ivan Misner, who is the founder and chairman of BNI, the world's largest business networking organization with more than 6,000 chapters. I think that's more chapters than we have, isn't it?
It's a couple more.
A couple more. Dr. Misner is a New York Times best-selling author. He's written 16 books,
Wow.
including the #1 bestseller, Networking Like a Pro, which I have, and I promise, Ivan, I'm going to read it at some point. And I am really thrilled to call him a friend and to have him here with us today on Cutting Edge Consciousness. Ivan, how are you?
I am doing great. If I were doing any better, I'd cancel my life insurance.
Well,
I can't actually do that because he's a BNI member. So
yeah, you may want to talk that through first, and don't get Sandy and Beth into the conversation, or it'll be Wednesday by the time you make a decision.
That's right.
So what about this whole thing, Ivan, this distinction between, I know as you put it, men are transactional and women are relational.
yeah, absolutely. It was one of the big things that we found in the book. And what I teach with networking, we teach what we call the VCP process: visibility, credibility, profitability.
Hang on one second. Before you go into the VCP process, I want to just lay up front for our audience that we're going to talk today about Ivan's new book, Business Networking and Sex.
Yeah, get that in there.
So one of those subjects I know very little about, and the other one I don't know a lot more. But it's not what you think, and we're going to have Ivan unpack that first with the VCP process.
Go back. Ivan, VCP.
Yeah. VCP.
Tell us about it.
Well, the book, people, Not What You Think is really important. It's about gender, the difference between men and women. But a title, we played around with a title with gender, but business networking and gender, wait a minute, can you hear the cricket? Nobody would pick that book up. So we went with business networking and sex, and talked about the difference between men and women. And we went into this thinking that men and women in the VCP process would differ. It's a chronological process. It begins with visibility. People have to know who you are and what you do. If you want to build relationships, you got to first be visible. But then you establish credibility. That's where people know who you are, they know what you do, and they know you're good at it. And then you can move to profitability, where people know who you are, they know what you do, they know you're good at it, and they're willing to pass you business and build a professional relationship with you over time. We thought, going into this, that women would go from visibility to credibility and get caught up in credibility and have a tendency, more than men, to not close the deal, to not ask for the sale.
But you took a survey on this.
We did. This was based on a survey of 12,000 people all over the world, every populated continent. And then we thought that men would have a tendency to go from visibility and try to go right to profitability, to go right to the deal. And it played out exactly that way, that women are more likely than men to get caught up into credibility and a little less likely to close the deal or ask for the sale. And men, man, they go right for profitability. Hazel, one of my co-authors, she likes to say, ladies, we've dated those guys.
Yes.
They're going right for profitability. So, yeah, men tend to be transactional. Women tend to be more relational, exactly as you laid out in your opening. We had one respondent who said, this is a quote, men seem to be more hesitant to build deep relationships, and women tend to focus too much on everything but business.
Yeah, and it begs an interesting, point that, there's an element of balance. Obviously, if someone is jumping the credibility component, they're skipping from "Hi, how are you?" to the altar. There's a disconnect. There's an imbalance, and the same is true if someone spends a lot of time in the credibility and never actually moves to closing the deal. And so the opportunity with the book, from my perspective, is to really look at these aspects within ourselves, of course, and really do some repair work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it turns out that one of those two approaches, transactional versus relational, is much better. That one is going to get you a lot more business than the other.
The farming, as you put it.
Yep, networking is more about farming than it is about hunting. And what we found was that people who tended to focus on building the relationship, whether they were a man or a woman, ended up doing much better in generating referrals than those people who just focused on the transaction.
It's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Barnett.
There are some practical. I'd like to ground this in the practicality of networking or dating, for that matter. There are some practical matters here. In the book, I was amazed that this seems so obvious, but only once it's pointed out, that men have a tendency in a networking situation to display their chauvinism or their status orientation, or to sexualize women. They're not as likely to look into their eyes as to maybe to look somewhere else. And
right.
The name badge conundrum.
That's right. I was just trying to get your name right.
The name badge. The name badge conundrum. And this is a really big deal. I had no idea how pervasive a problem this was, what a big challenge this was for women, and how deeply they felt about it, and how aware they are.
And can we say a deep challenge for guys? Look, I don't want to be that guy. I mean, I get that a lot of us are conditioned to do that stuff, but that's not the behavior I want to exhibit personally. So I think it's a challenge for everybody.
Well, what do you think, Ivan?
Well, we found something. We came up with something that I think is really interesting, because when we looked at the objective data between men and women, and again, this is based on 12,000 surveys, and the way the whole book is laid out is I start off by saying this is what the survey says, and I try to do it in a gender neutral way. And then Frank DeRaffley, my co-author, says he has the he says. So here's what the men say, and then Hazel say, here's what the women say, and they have anything but a gender-neutral perspective. And we were a little concerned that when we first saw the data, it's like saying Mars and Venus aren't two different planets, they're two different cities in the same county. They were pretty close in a lot of areas.
Right.
And then we did something interesting. We looked at the open-ended answers, and the open-ended answers will address your question. We got 1,000 open-ended responses where people commented, where we said, tell us a story about networking with the opposite sex. And my goodness, what a huge difference between men and women. I mean, you talk about the problem of men sexualizing women. You had no idea until you read some of this data. For example, there was 4 comments in a row. Ironically, 4 in a row. First 3 were women, last one's a guy. First 3 say things like, I hate going to, and they're women. I hate going to networking events. Men are pigs. I find networking very frustrating. All they want is a date. Men just want a date. They go there and they're looking for a date. 3 of them in a row. Woman, very upset. 4th one's a guy. He says, I love networking events. They're a great way to pick up chicks. On behalf of men everywhere, I would like to apologize.
Because this is the exception rather than the rule, right?
But it stigmatizes men across the board.
That's right. That's accurate.
Is we found that the exception becomes the perception.
Yes.
The exception becomes the perception. We call it the 98-2 rule. That 98% of the men in a networking environment behave professionally. But that 2% who don't really ruin it for everyone else, because what are the women talking about? They're talking about those few men who behave badly. Let's flip that. Let's talk about dressing provocatively. We had a lot of women who complained about women dressing provocatively. We had men complain about women. Well, actually, they didn't complain, but they commented on women dressing provocatively. But really, do most women in a business environment dress provocatively?
Right. No, of course not.
It's the handful. It's that 2%. So it's that the exception becomes the perception is a key element in this book.
Now, men, again, to pursue this hunting v. farming metaphor, men are traditionally full of will and action.
Yeah.
And as you said, they want to go right to profitability. And so they are more likely to be comfortable, maybe inappropriately, overly comfortable about the ask.
Yeah, no question about it. And we saw that in the results. We also learned a lot in doing some interviews with experts in the area. A mutual friend of ours, Dr. John Gray, who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, really contributed a lot to the book. And when we told him that men had that tendency, he wasn't at all surprised. And he said, look, it's not all their fault. It's part biology. And part of the problem truly is biology, because with men, when you solve problems, when you're in a competitive situation and you try to fix that problem, which is in this case, make sales, that actually increases testosterone, which reduces stress.
Yeah.
And that collaborative behavior increases estrogen in men. And well, you know what happens when you've got men with too much estrogen around? It doesn't go over well. It actually increases stress. And so a collaboration is actually biologically more difficult, and it played out in what we saw in terms of men and women in networking.
Wow. Well, I think that the challenge here is to recognize, similar to what you were talking about, how the exception becomes the perception, is that the tendency, which we can point to and say, here are all the reasons for the tendency, it's still a tendency, and it doesn't mean it's a hard, fast rule that has no potential to change.
No, it's not a hard, fast rule.
Right.
There are a lot of men who are very collaborative. And you have to remember that when you're looking at statistical data, the data that we talk about was statistically significant, which means that there's less than a 5% chance of error. But that if you're talking about averages in anything, generally speaking, half are above the average and half are below the average. So, that doesn't mean that all men are that way by any stretch of the imagination, but they're more likely to be than a woman.
More likely to be, right.
Well, we're going to step away and pay a couple of bills. When we come back in a minute, I want to talk to you, Ivan, about the story of Paul and Jacqueline. So if it says you better run for your book, Ivan, and refresh yourself.
That's right.
We will be right back.